Hey everybody, this is Blake here, and welcome to my review of Django Unchained, the latest film by Quentin Tarantino. Now, I love Tarantino. Most of his movies have been incredibly enjoyable, but at the same time, I have to admit that he is pretty overrated. When somebody lists him as being one of the greatest filmmakers of all time, I tend to get kind of snarky and pompous because, at least in my opinion, the greatest filmmakers are the guys whom everybody else pays tribute to, whether it's Kurosawa, John Ford, Scorsese, Spielberg during his earlier days, whereas Tarantino is sort of the opposite. He wants to make movies, at least these days, that are just homages to past greats. Inglourious Basterds, for example, even though it is technically directed by Quentin Tarantino, he's using a lot of the same tricks that Sergio Leone invented. And then the music in his movies is rarely original. He lifts tracks from other films, such as Django or Revolver, or any of the Morricone scores from the Leone westerns. And I'm not entirely sure if he deserves all that praise when he is just borrowing a lot from everybody else. But at the same time, he does it so well because he can recreate the magic that these past filmmakers invented. So, for example, a movie I didn't care for was Doomsday. That relied on a lot of homages, just as Tarantino's film did. But all that did was remind me of other great movies instead of being great itself. But whenever I watch Inglourious Basterds, it reminds me so much of Leone at his finest when he did his spaghetti westerns, even though the movie isn't a spaghetti western itself. And he does it just so well. So even though he's just reusing scenes or tracks from past movies, he's doing them just as well as they were done before. So that's always left me with mixed feelings, but regardless of what I feel, I do love the bulk of his movies. Pulp Fiction was amazing, Reservoir Dogs was amazing, Kill Bill was awesome, I also loved Inglourious Basterds. Jackie Brown, I wouldn't call it great, but I do really like it. Kill Bill Volume 2 was underwhelming compared to the first one, but was still a solid film in its own right. And Death Proof isn't bad, but it's not particularly good. It just, I have theories as to why that film isn't so hot compared to his other movies. But now we get to Django Unchained, and I was really looking forward to this one because this is one of his only movies that actually more or less takes place in its in the right setting, because, you know, like Kill Bill was a 70s samurai film that takes place in a modern day setting, and then Inglourious Basterds was a spaghetti western that takes place in a war setting, and this one actually is also spaghetti western pretty much, but does more or less have the western setting. And plus, the cast looked great, the trailers looked funny, and, you know, I was really looking forward to seeing that same Tarantino magic. You know, his brand of dialogue mixed in with pretty much Sergio Leone's, or whatever the guy's name was who did Django. I can't think of it off the top of my head. You know, their styles pretty much recreated for a modern day movie. I was a little disappointed. That's not to say that Django Unchained is a bad movie. I'd say without a doubt it's better than Death Proof and Kill Bill Volume 2. But it's one of those films that I think highlights Tarantino's weaknesses and strengths as a filmmaker. Now, you might disagree with me. You might believe that it is one of his best movies, because that's presumably because either you don't agree with me when it comes to his weaknesses, or you just didn't notice them, and all credit to you if you felt that way. On the other hand, you might hate Tarantino, and you'll really hate this movie just because it is what you expect out of a Tarantino film, for better or worse. I'm going to start with what I did not like about the movie. It relies way too much on homages, to the point where they become really gratuitous. Usually when Tarantino references a past movie or a TV show or whatever, he actually does so in a way that affects the narrative, so it's not gratuitous. This one, probably one of the worst examples, is when Franco Nero, who played the original Django, he shows up in just a small cameo. He's the guy you see in the trailer who he asks Django what his name is, and then he says, Django, the D is silent. Well, the conversation in the movie is more like this. What is your name? Django. spell it. Django. The D is silent. And then Franco Nero kind of looks at him and says, I know. And then he walks away. You know, it's kind of cool seeing Franco Nero again, because I wasn't even aware that he was still alive. But that scene just wasn't necessary. I wish they tied that in better into the rest of the story. For example, Kill Bill had Hattori Hanzo played by Sonny Chiba. That is actually a really good reference done right, because he affected the story. This part with Franco Nero did not. And there's a few scenes that they're obviously referencing other classics, but they just didn't feel necessary. Like there's a Son of a Gunfighter reference, kind of clever, but it's padding, and that sort of ties into my next problem is the editing is pretty uneven. For those who don't know, the person who edited Tarantino's previous films passed away, unfortunately, after Inglourious Basterds. So he had to get a new editor, and while you might not notice, it seemed like there were a lot more scenes that I felt could have been trimmed down or cut out completely. For example, there's this one little bit where they just killed a bunch of outlaws. I don't remember exactly who, but they talk to this marshal who offers them cake. Why was that even there? I mean, that wasn't particularly a funny scene. It wasn't important to the story. Now, you could argue that it tied into Schultz, played by Christoph Waltz, his development, because they sort of have a scene later on where he turns down having white cake from DiCaprio's character. So you could argue that that's just going to show how much he despises DiCaprio, and it's not necessarily what he says it's about sweets. But that's still not necessary. We already know what he feels about DiCaprio's character, and that's just sort of a pointless attempt at, I don't know, driving that point home. And there's another sort of a running theme where Django will see his wife, visions of her just standing out there in the distance, and it's supposed to show us how, you know, he's constantly thinking about her. She's always on his mind. But even then, I didn't need to know that, because I presumed that, and I think you could have easily shown that whole idea just through the acting, the actors, showing those emotions or whatever. So that just seemed very insignificant and very fillery, and it just added to the running time, which was already pretty long. Then there's some like weird editing parts where they'll suddenly cut to a scene that either took place before or after during the middle of another scene, and it's like, why did they need to do that? It was kind of distracting and awkward. So that's for the most part how I'd sum up the weaknesses. I felt that the editing could have been better. They could have trimmed out certain parts, and I sort of believe that because Tarantino was working with somebody who hadn't edited his previous films, that maybe they didn't feel like they could pose him more, that they couldn't argue that certain scenes needed to be cut out. Like I could see Tarantino, for example, pushing for Bruce Dern's cameo remaining in there. He's Django's former owner who sells him and his wife. It's just one quick scene that's done in a flashback, and that wasn't necessary either. And I kind of suspect that maybe at some point these parts were more relevant, that maybe they would have tied in much better, but through rewrites they eventually just were reduced to nothing. But I feel that had the original editor not died and done this movie with them, they probably just would have cut a lot of that out, and it would have been much shorter and much more compelling. My final complaint is I felt it climaxed too early. There's this one awesome action scene where it's incredibly darkly humorous, but it's also very bloody, reminding me of when the bride takes on the Crazy 88 gang in Kill Bill. But it's like you think the movie's going to end shortly after that, but then it goes on for like another 25 minutes or so, and it just never could match that scene, so everything afterwards just kind of feels dull in comparison. Even though there's nothing about it that is bad. I mean, the final shootout was still pretty good, but just that one scene was just too awesome for its own good. So now that I've explained what I did not like about the movie, why do I think that it is a good film? Well, the first thing is that it's still very funny. The dialogue is very clever and witty, but also very quotable and surprisingly badass. And a lot of the times it's how the actors deliver the lines than the lines themselves. Like, I keep thinking of you had my curiosity, but now you have my attention line. It's so great. I love just saying that. And Leonardo DiCaprio really sold that and made that line much more memorable than it probably originally was intended to be. A lot of people have been complaining about that it's very anti-white, or that it makes a comedy out of slavery. I know Spike Lee has been bitching a lot, and I cannot stand Spike Lee anymore. Miracles at St. Anna was sucky as hell, and I feel that he's guilty of blaxploitation more than most blaxploitation movies are. But the movie never treats slavery lightly. In fact, it's more gritty and brutal than most of these movies. And even though there are times where you're supposed to be like awesome towards the violence, whenever that's directed towards a slave, it's never meant to be pleasant. It's very harsh and hard to watch. Then I don't even know why anybody would argue that it's anti-white, because the most sympathetic character in the movie is a white person. And that's another thing that I really like too, is Django starts off as more sympathetic towards his victims, but then he becomes more cold-blooded as time goes on, to where you wonder if he's really kind of a villain by the end of the movie. Whereas his partner, Schultz, he starts off as the more ruthless guy, but he becomes more and more compassionate as the movie goes on. So by the end of the film, he's much more driven by emotions than logic, which completely is different from how he began. So I liked how they kind of went the opposite directions of how they began, and that was really well done, I thought. The characters are all incredibly well written, and you want to see more of them. Like, I always love that I can name almost all the characters in Tarantino's films. You have Django, Schultz, Candy, Broomhilda, I believe her name was, the Speck brothers, the Brittle brothers. It's filled with so many interesting characters played by great actors, and that's usually problematic, because when I think of most Leonardo DiCaprio characters, I think of Leonardo DiCaprio, yet I automatically remember he's playing Candy, and I remember that name, and I remember the character traits, and everybody's just so interesting and fun to watch that you just want so much more of them. But I think that's really awesome that Tarantino is so good at creating interesting characters, even in the small and insignificant parts. So Django Unchained is no different in that regard. I guess I should talk a little bit about the acting. I was surprised because the standout performance for me was Samuel Jackson. He plays Stephen, who's a slave. And while I do like Samuel Jackson, I've always considered him to be more of a performer than an actor. He's always playing Samuel Jackson. But here he does a lot more in terms of his body language, his facial expressions, his voice, the way he talks. It's much more different than what I'm used to seeing with Samuel Jackson. He's actually acting. He's playing a totally different character instead of just being Samuel Jackson. So that really threw me off guard. But everybody else does good too. Leonardo DiCaprio is a lot of fun as the villain. He's very over the top, and at one point he slams his hand down so hard that in real life he actually cut it, but without missing a beat, he incorporates that into the scene, and it's really kind of weird and creepy, but you love to watch. He's one of those villains that you love to hate. And Jamie Foxx, he works as Django. He's kind of playing the man of few words, and I liked how he develops, and you could really see his development in his performance. He has a lot of charisma, and I enjoyed him a lot. They should have had him play Alex Cross instead of Tyler Perry, because I think he could have done that role really, really well. Christoph Waltz is still my favorite. He's pretty much reprising his role from Inglourious Basterds, but this time it's as a good guy. You know, he delivers his dialogue in a way that's just so charming and captivating, and you just love him to death. Yeah, he's probably my favorite character in the whole movie. And then everybody else who shows up does a great job too. There's no weak links. The story is very episodic, but sometimes it leads into like these. In fact, you could really say this could have been trimmed out too, but I'm glad they didn't. The KKK scene is hilarious. Jonah Hill shows up for no reason whatsoever. It's almost like he just kind of wandered on the set and they just threw him into the movie. He has like one or two lines, but that whole scene was just side-splitting, probably the funniest part in the whole movie. But for the most part, I thought, even though it's episodic, it was pretty well paced up until the ending. That's when I felt during the second half was when it started to slow down a little bit, but I had no problems with that. Anything else I could say? I've got to look at my notes. Even though it is pretty funny, it is also very bloody and gritty and action-packed, and so expect, you might even think that it's almost a little bipolar in its tone. I disagree because I always saw the comedy as being of a darker nature. It's never meant to be lighthearted. It's really a black comedy at its core, but it also is incredibly bloody, and you have to be ready for that. I love that aspect, though. As always, I thought the music was great. He's more or less borrowing tracks from other movies. I felt some of the more contemporary stuff felt out of place, but for the most part, whenever I'd recognize a tune from a spaghetti western, I was pleased. My favorite part in that regard was when they play, I believe it's called La Corsa. It's the music that plays when Django confronts the Brittle Brothers. I thought that fit the best, in the same way that the theme from Revolver fit in Inglourious Bastards, what fit in Kill Bill? The Lady Snowblood soundtrack at the end of the first Kill Bill. I thought that was also even though the music wasn't composed and written obviously for this movie, it felt just like you could not imagine that scene happening without it. Then the cinematography is good, but it doesn't stand out quite as much as it did in Inglourious Bastards, which was really exceptional in that regard. Here, it's good enough to fit the type of movie that Tarantino's going for, but nothing special. So would I recommend it? If you like Tarantino, obviously. I'm only disappointed, as I said, in that I expected greatness, but instead I just got a pretty good movie, and that's enough. If you don't like Tarantino, don't watch it. It's going to represent everything you hate about him, but I definitely recommend it if you are a fan of his. I believe that's all I really have left to talk about. If you go to my website, I released a written review of Ninja's Creed, which was horrible, horrible, horrible. And I just watched that right after Django Unchained, which probably made it worse, too. And then I also did a review of a much better film called House of Fury, so go ahead and read those. Follow me on Twitter. Critiquing the Critics is going to be pushed back another week just because I got some interesting gifts for Christmas that really are going to change the way Critiquing the Critics is done. You'll have to see what I'm talking about when I actually make the video. But that is all I have to say. I'll see you guys later.